All of your local and state news in one place. Tune into The District on WHIP, Philly's #1 college radio station. Welcome to The District. I'm Taylor Allen, and we're talking all about state and local news this beautiful Saturday morning. My co-host John Cole could not be here today, but we're going to try again and just see how it is just with me here. So diving straight into local news, Philadelphia. Protesters rally in Philadelphia against the Dakota Access Pipeline. Now, what you need to know about Philadelphia is that within the last week, there has been many protests, mostly focusing on last week's results of the presidential election, but also a lot of things centering on social issues, whether it's feminism, women's rights, civil rights, LGBT rights. A lot of protests and demonstrations have been going on around the city. But this one specifically is about the Dakota Access Pipeline. Now, this one happened in Center City. It was Tuesday morning, and it ended around 10 a.m., so it wasn't a very long one. The large crowd led to traffic delays in the area. So it really wasn't too big. It was about 200 people, so it was sizable, but it didn't cause any kind of really big distress in the city other than some minor delays. What you should know about this is that the controversial issue of the Dakota Pipeline, essentially, is that the members of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, Native Americans who live in that area, have been protesting the oil line, which will travel under the Missouri River. The tribe says the pipeline threatens drinking water and cultural sites. Specifically, on those cultural sites, it's very sacred burial grounds. A lot of those grounds encompass bodies of very big chiefs, very notable people within that tribe, and they think it would be an abridgment of the government's power to go against the understanding that these are very sacred grounds, and they don't want the government to impede on it, especially since technically it is the tribe's land. However, there is a pro side of this. There are people who are for the Dakota Access Pipeline. These people say that the pipeline will be an economic boom, okay? There's so much oil, almost billions of oil under this burial site, that the pipeline would be an economic boom. It would diminish, well, not diminish, but severely lower the United States' reliance on foreign oil. So it's saving money, and it'll probably make jobs for people who are in the area who would crude this oil. But again, most people who are against this construction of the pipe will, quote, destroy our burial lines, prayer sites, and culturally significant artifacts. That's what the Standing Rock Sioux tribe said. The opponents also cite environmental concerns, mostly includes possible contamination due to breaches in eventual greenhouse gas emissions. People are very concerned that the pipeline will eventually lead to some leakage in certain water reserves, and that will lead to water contamination. So those are really just the two sides of the Dakota Access Pipeline. But the protest itself, which was in Philadelphia on Tuesday, was very peaceful. Majority of the people in the city are pretty against the Dakota Access Pipeline. There has been a poll, according to Philly.com, that says that the majority of the people within the city are against the Dakota Access Pipeline. That isn't particularly surprising, just because Philadelphia tends to be pretty liberal. People who are for the Dakota Access Pipeline, this is a generalization, so not all conservatives think this way, but many of them are pro because it's very much a benefit to the United States. I don't think anyone's disputing that the Dakota Access Pipeline would be beneficial to the United States economy. It would be. However, there are other effects that could be into play. Like previously stated before, it could lead to water contamination. It could contribute to global warming, which is already a problem across the world. And you are going on grounds that technically are not ours. Those lands are part of Standing Rock Sioux tribe in North Dakota. So we don't exactly know what's going to happen with this story, but we'll be looking at it. Continuing on still hyper-local Philadelphia news, the CIA and NSA are ordered to reveal to a judge whether they were involved in Occupy Philly's surveillance. Okay, let's break this down. So, Occupy protesters spent weeks camped outside of City Hall back in November of 2011. The point of them protesting was to seek to draw attention to income equality before police dispersed them, again back in November 2011, to make way for the $50 million renovation of what was then Dilworth Plaza. Okay, so it has become to the attention that the NSA and the CIA may have been watching these protesters. And I guess the biggest question is why? Why were they looking at protesters? Because regardless of whether or not you like what protesters are saying, it is a right to the American people. Protesting is very much an American thing. You have the freedom of speech, you have the freedom to dissent, you have the freedom to protest. So there is a very gray area, and there is a lot of questioning as to why is this allowed? Why are intelligence agencies watching people who are just exercising their natural born right? So, in essence, a federal judge has ordered the CIA and the National Security Agency to disclose to him whether they were involved in spying on Occupy Philadelphia protesters during their month-long demonstration at what is now Dilworth Park 5 years ago. So, going on with the story, responding to the Freedom of Information Act lawsuit filed by the lawyer of the demonstrations, the U.S. District Judge Burl M. Schiller gave the agencies until next year to submit a list of any records detailing the agency's potential surveillance activities, along with a justification of why those documents should be withheld from public disclosure. Now, that is also another part of this ongoing lawsuit. These agencies, the CIA and the National Security Agency, cannot confirm nor deny if they were watching the protesters. I don't know, that does not seem the most comforting news. Taking it back to real simpler terms, most people know whether or not they did something, okay? National Security Agency would not confirm or deny if it had any records related to the demonstration. However, they did say that if those records were present and if they did actually have those records, they would be classified. So not only are these intelligence agencies saying that they were watching people who they probably shouldn't have been watching, to be frank, they're saying that if they were, it's still none of their business whether or not they were watching innocent people because that's classified information. I don't know. I don't particularly care for this story, if I'm being honest. This is my opinion. But I find it very hard to believe that intelligence agencies, one, don't even know if they have certain material relating to watching people exercise their right to protest. And two, I find it almost ludicrous to claim that these records are classified when you are watching people without their consent. The people who you were watching, bare minimum, they should be the ones allowed to see what you have taken, what surveillance you have, is because it is of them and therefore they should have that right. However, I do understand that NSA and the CIA, they do potentially really spy on people for the benefit and security of this nation. I understand that, but it's not as if these people were really a threat. There were protesters talking about income inequality. There really isn't a whole lot to convince me, at least, that there was a lot of reasoning behind why you would look after these people. And the fact that this case is now coming up, and this was 5 years ago, the original occurrence of the protests about Occupy Philadelphia was 5 years ago. It's taken 5 years for this problem to even show its face to court. So I'm wondering how long this is even going to take, and will it set a precedent? Let's just say this lawsuit continues to go, and the judge rules that you can't surveillance anyone, and it sets a precedent in Philadelphia and maybe even Pennsylvania. Will this change the way that intelligence agencies are allowed to view American citizens, regular American citizens? Will it change? I don't know, maybe unlikely, but this would set a precedent. I think it already sets a precedent because a Philadelphia judge is already looking at this case. The grand scheme of most people don't even question why the government does certain things. The majority of Americans go into this typical thought process of the government has our best interest in mind, and I would like to think that the government still does. However, I do think it does raise some questions. Why are you looking at innocent people? I don't know, but this is nowhere near finished. The judge has only ordered the CIA and NSA to disclose whatever footage they have, and they have at least a year to come up with an excuse of why they have it. So we will be looking into this as times progress, and we'll just see what happens. Oh, also, things still in Philadelphia. 5 new charter schools apply to open in Philly. Okay, charter schools will always be a hot topic, especially in Philadelphia. But if approved, the schools would add more than 3,000 students to charter roles in the city. Now, you should know that there are currently 86 charters in the city. These proposed schools include the Friendship Whittier Charter, which would serve 695 pre-K students to 5th grade students in the Allegheny West section of the city. KIPP, or KIPP Parkside Charter, would educate 770 kindergarten through 8th grade students in West Parkside Metropolitan Philadelphia Classical Charter, which proposes a 674 K through 12th grade student body in Cedarbrook. Deep Roots Charter, which wants 450 kindergarten to 8th grade students in Harrogate. and Wilbur Wright's Aerospace and Aviation Academy, which would serve 600 high school students in Strawberry Mansion. Now, by law, the School Reform Commission must open applications for new charters each year, but their consideration is a hot-button issue. They have to consider it, but whether or not they approve it is completely up to them. Now, if you don't know, the School Reform Commission essentially is the organization that heads and controls every public-funded school in Philadelphia. Notice how I said public funded and not necessarily public school. They are in charge of the implementation of all public schools in the city and all charter schools because it's still publicly funded, it's still paid with taxpayer money. Okay. So the big drawback of charter schools in the city, the reason why it's so controversial, is that charter schools, although they can be beneficial depending on really their location and who runs it, charter schools are nonprofits typically, and charter schools are unregulated most of the time, to be honest. Charter schools are entities that essentially you buy a school, you have kids be educated there, but there really aren't a lot of rules. Theoretically, teachers in that charter school don't necessarily have to have certification. They don't necessarily need a license to teach. They don't even really need a college degree, essentially, because a charter school is completely their own thing. They're not really regulated. So theoretically, someone who is very qualified for the job or someone who is not qualified at all could be teaching your children. That is the main drawback of charter schools. Some of the other opponent views is that opening and expanding charters comes at the expense of traditional public schools. Remember, charter schools are still publicly funded. If you take another school and it's still publicly funded by people's taxes, without the charter schools, all of that money would go to public schools, okay? But when you have charter schools, obviously that splits the money, and not as much money would go to the public schools. That is another drawback, is that charter schools, although they can be good, again, depending on who's in charge of it and depending on location, charter schools can be beneficial, but it does come at the expense to public schools because you are taking some of that money, whether or not that is the intent. Now, proponents of charter schools, on the flip side, point to that, public schools in Philadelphia are not the greatest. This is not new news. Education in Philadelphia has always been a hot topic. It has always been something that has need to be reformed. Hence, the name of the biggest entity that controls the education in Philadelphia. They're called the School Reform Commission. I don't think there's anything more blatant to talk about the state of Philadelphia when the name of the thing that controls all the public schools in Philadelphia has the word reform. Philadelphia's public school system needs to be reformed. As many urban areas, this is always a common problem, but this isn't new. Philadelphia has been in shambles when it comes to education for decades. Now, another thing with Philadelphia's history with charter schools, between 2007 and 2015, the district has approved no freestanding charters. In 2015, it authorized 6. Earlier this year, it greenlighted 3 more. So, this is pure speculation. This is not fact. The fact that just last year, in 2015, the SRC authorized 6, and even earlier this year, in 2016, it greenlighted 3 more, there's a very good chance that these 5 charter schools that are applying to open in Philly has a pretty decent shot of being open. The School Reform Commission is already approving schools at a pretty standard rate, a pretty high rate, so I personally don't see any reason why they wouldn't approve 5 more charter schools, just if I'm thinking about the history of how often they are approving these charter schools. But there's nothing we can really do now or really speculate, at least not for a while, because the School Reform Commission will vote on the applications next year, as in 2017. So we do have a longer time to think about this, but the conversation of charter schools versus public schools is a very hot button issue. Again, charter schools can be beneficial. There are very obvious benefits, okay? It's a way that you can save Philadelphia's school system because the public schools obviously have not been working, so this is an alternative option. Charter schools give parents a choice to send their children to either a charter school or a public school. It enhances the power of choice. However, it does disenfranchise public schools. And although the public schools in Philadelphia are not the greatest, no one is arguing that, at least they have better regulation. No one can argue that charter schools have better regulation because they simply do not. Charter school can do whatever they please, theoretically. That can be a good or bad thing, all depending on who is running that school. And unfortunately, there is not a lot of checking on that, on who these people are that open them. Essentially, if you have the money to create a charter school, there really isn't a reason that you can't. I just stated it right here. Between 2007 and 2015, the district approved no new standing, but within the last year, they authorized 6. So Philadelphia is definitely in favor of charter schools as of right now, but it is a controversial issue. The SRC will vote on it starting next year. Still keeping it really hyper-local into Philadelphia, a new Pew report came out. The tax gap is shrinking between Philadelphia and the suburbs. Now, the tax gap between Philadelphia and the suburbs has closed by about 3 full percentage points over the last 15 years for middle-income families. Now, for those of you who don't know, tax burden, for clarification, is defined as the percentage of gross income that the family would owe on the major non-federal taxes: state and local income taxes, state and local sales taxes, and local property taxes. Now, what you need to know is that most people would rather live in the suburbs rather than Philadelphia. I mean, there's a host of reasons, but one of those main reasons is that more densely populated areas usually have higher taxes. That's just a fact. The further you go out of a highly densely populated area, aka cities, the lower your taxes tend to be. But as recently as 2012, when Pew first observed and reported on this trend, the average city-suburban tax gap was only 1-2 percentage points, or about $750 in taxes per year. That fell to 0.6 percentage points, about $390 in the past 3 years alone. So, in comparison to Philadelphia and the suburbs, compared to other cities and the suburban places around that city, Philadelphia is pretty good when it comes to taxes, generally. It's not as high as other cities. So a major contributor to this now narrowing gap was Philadelphia's enactment of the Homestead Relief Program in 2013, which offers real estate tax savings to homeowners by reducing the taxable portion of their property assessment by $30,000. Now, the resulting savings in that is about $415. Without that real estate tax savings, the tax gap for Philadelphia would have risen in the past 3 years instead of decreased. So the biggest difference between Philadelphia and other cities is that we have the real estate tax savings, which really helps keeps the taxes down. So therefore, Philadelphia has become one of the most affordable cities. Even better news about Philadelphia, among all the municipalities included in this Pew study, Philadelphia came in with the 97th highest tax burden. Now, I know I said this was good news that Philadelphia came in as the 97th highest tax burden, and I know that sounds pretty bad, but it's actually pretty good news. It means that it's very low on the list. There's actually not a lot of cities in America as a whole, and for it to be 97th, that's actually quite notable, especially since it was much higher on the list. It was actually like in the 50s, like in the 50th, 60th range of the highest tax burden only about a decade ago. So they have come down on that list quite considerably. So in essence, the end of the story is move to Philadelphia because it's a very affordable city. There's no reason for you to just hang out in the suburbs if that's your main reason is your taxes. Philadelphia is very affordable, and it's pretty highly populated, but I encourage everyone to live here. I love it here. And finally, we're moving on to some state news. Pennsylvania is to lay off nearly 600 jobless workers due to a funding shortfall. Okay, so let me break this down. What exactly happened was that the Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry announced Thursday that 600 workers would be laid off because funding to administer unemployment benefits to out-of-work residents was not approved. The department secretary, Kathy Mandarino, blamed the layoffs on the state Senate's failure to vote on a bill designed to modernize how unemployment benefits are handled. The House bill that the Department Secretary Kathy Mandarino was talking about is House Bill 2375. Now, this bill was passed by the State House in a bipartisan effort back on October 19th. This bill would have provided $57.5 million in funding to improve the quality, efficiency, and timeliness of unemployment services. But this was not passed when it went to the Senate. And that night, which was Wednesday night when it wasn't passed, Governor Tom Wolf released a statement warning that layoffs were imminent after the Senate adjourned Wednesday night. So, what is going on right now is that people who are already unemployed are not going to have benefits. There are pros and cons to this issue. I know many people are against unemployment benefits to people in general. People need to understand that unemployment is typically for people who just recently lost their job and are having difficulty finding work. Unemployment benefits are usually for a specific amount of time and varies from state to state. I know back in New Jersey there was a cap on about 2 years. I don't exactly know about Pennsylvania's rules about how long someone can be on unemployment. But a lot of people have gripes against unemployment because a lot of people are under the impression that people who are unemployment are essentially living off of the system, are parasites of the system. I'm not going to say whether or not I agree with that, but there are certain instances that people need help. Government assistance is needed in a lot of circumstances. And whether or not you agree with unemployment, this is a very unfortunate thing that is happening to 600 people. Whether or not you agree that they should have unemployment, there should be an understanding that these people now do not have a livelihood, they do not have an income at all as of right now. This happened as immediately as Thursday morning. The Senate adjourned Wednesday night, and now people don't have their benefits Thursday morning. People need time to get a job. I do not know the specifics on how long you can be on unemployment in Pennsylvania, as I previously said, but there are 600 people now who do not have an income at all. And this was a bipartisan bill. This was not just a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. This was a bipartisan bill that was not passed. So you cannot even blame that this was like, oh, it's the Democrats' fault or it was the Republicans' fault. It was a bipartisan bill. Pennsylvania is a pretty moderate state, as previously stated in other episodes of the district. Tom Wolf is a Democrat. He's a Democratic governor, but he has a Republican legislature. But again, Pennsylvania is pretty moderate, and this bill was bipartisan, and it was essentially struck down Wednesday night, which is pretty surprising. At least for me, it's surprising just because it seemed like both sides were on board, but apparently not. I would be very shocked if there was going to be another bill passed, or at least another bill being drawn to combat this bill that was just cut off, is because I'm sure there will be a few senators or a few representatives who definitely want to help these 600 people who became jobless literally overnight. So I'll be very surprised if there isn't another bill underway in the next few months, in the upcoming months. But as far as that goes, that is the end of the district. Everything was hyper-local this week, and not a lot actually centered on elections. Election season is officially over. But there will always be politics, always the news to talk about, especially in the Philadelphia surrounding areas, and definitely of Pennsylvania. I hope you stay tuned on WHIP, keep checking in with the district, and I'll talk to you next week.